This might be the newest type of Pokemon card we have ever talked about in any video on this channel, as we are going over every single Radiant card. And we have to start within Astral Radiance, where we would get the Radiant Heatran card. I feel like almost every Radiant Pokemon card at some point was usable within the TCG. Heatran is certainly not a Pokemon with the most recognizable shiny design, however it is still a pretty cool shiny. This Heatran had the pretty decent move Raging Blast, where for every damage counter on this Pokemon you would do 70 damage. With a 160 HP pool, this meant that the card worked really well into decks that love to spread damage around. The problem is that the most recognizable of these cards within recent years is Munkidori, and by the time Munkidori was released in Shrouded Fable, people started to move on from Astral Radiance. It didn't really survive much longer in legal play anyway. The Radiant Heatran sells today for $2. If you guys do enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe. It really helps out and gets the channel pushed to more people. The Radiant cards really are not that expensive. Most people would have been able to pack pull each and every one of them across various packs and promotions. They're all kind of OP, but had various methods of balancing. Perhaps the most memorable and recognizable of these Radiant Pokemon is the Radiant Greninja. Radiant Greninja was by far the strongest Radiant card ever released. It didn't matter if you were running a Palkia V-Star or a Raging Bolt deck. Greninja's concealed cards ability worked wonders for you. For a while as well, some people also started to utilize the Moonlight Shuriken attack too, particularly within Palkia V-Star decks. Talking about tournament placements for Greninja is stupid because it was used in just so many decks. Hundreds if not thousands of people have used this card at regionals, internationals, and of course World Championships. This Radiant Greninja sells today for $2. There was also an organized play version of this card that was given out at various tournaments, with the Play Pokemon stamped version which sells for $50. So Greninja may be the most recognizable, but we still have some pretty crazy Radiant cards coming up, such as the Radiant Hawlucha. Radiant Hawlucha is one of those Radiant cards that largely got overshadowed by the rest of them. If you had a toss-up between Radiant Greninja and Radiant Hawlucha, then 9 times out of 10 you would be running Radiant Greninja. The Radiant Hawlucha was not bad into certain decks, but the problem was the decks it was good into was so specific. Hawlucha's ability Big Match meant that all of your Pokemon did 30 more damage to VMAX Pokemon. The issue here is that by Astral Radiance we were starting to get the V-Star Pokemon, and so VMAX Pokemon usage was going down pretty steadily. Unlike Greninja, this card was never used at a Worlds tournament, at least not with a good placement. It placed awfully at NAIC in 2022 with a 101st and 127th placement. However, this card was part of the first place deck in the Malaysia Regional with the Hisuian Zoroark deck. The Radiant Hawlucha sells today for $2, but once again there was an organized play promo with the Play Pokemon stamp which sells for $20. That does it for Astral Radiance, so let's head into Pokemon Go, where we have all of the Kanto starters. As I said earlier in the video, technically none of the Radiant Pokemon are actually bad or not useful. The real problem is the Radiant Pokemon rule, where you are restricted to one Radiant Pokemon per deck. In a situation like this, why would you bring a Radiant Venusaur over something like Radiant Greninja? Radiant Venusaur has the Sunny Bloom ability, which lets you draw cards at the end of your turn, up to 4 cards in hand. This was great for decks that required a lot of discarded cards, but of course it caused the issue of quickly depleting your deck. This card only ever really had one notable appearance at the Brisbane Regional with this Durant deck. This deck was primarily a stall and control deck, and it slowly discarded cards from your opponent's deck, while also getting rid of energy with the Yveltal card from Celebrations. This was the best placement Radiant Venusaur ever had, with this deck ending in 3rd place. Outside of that, it wasn't really used that much. The Radiant Venusaur sells today for $5. Much like Radiant Greninja earlier, there is one more Radiant card that a lot of people would remember, the Radiant Charizard. This Pokemon was a monster for a while, thanks to its Excited Heart ability. You could turn the tide of just about any game right at the last moment. Excited Heart would reduce the energy requirement for Radiant Charizard's Combustion Blast attack. If your opponent took 4 prize cards, then this attack would only require 1 fire energy to do 250 damage. This card was very strong, especially when it came to last minute efforts to win. This is one of very few cards that was able to do this, with the other notable one in recent years being Blood Moon Ursaluna. The card had a lot of placements in a lot of tournaments and remained in legal play for a while thanks to its re-release within Crown Zenith. The best placement I could find for this card was at the LAIC tournament for 2024-25 in Sao Paulo, with a Charizard Pidgeot deck to win it all. Coincidentally, this card would also win at the same tournament in the Junior Division. The Pokemon Go version of this card sells for around $15 today, whereas the Crown Zenith version sells for around $8. There was also an organized play version of this card released too that sells for $130. And finally, that brings us to Radiant Blastoise. This Pokemon doesn't really have any placements that I could find. It was kind of forgettable and was rarely ever used. However, this is kind of interesting to me, as I would have thought the Radiant Blastoise would have seen way more play. Its Pump Shot ability lets you put 2 damage counters onto a bunch punched Pokemon on your opponent's side as long as you discard water energy. This sounds a bit better than it is though. This in theory would have worked really well into Palkia V-Star. However, the ability to draw cards when you discard an energy like Radiant Greninja was way more viable of an option than the Radiant Blastoise. On top of that, its torrential cannon attack had a 1-turn cooldown, meaning it was a very slow damage dealer, especially into the 250 to 300 HP V-Star cards. The Radiant Blastoise sells today for $8. There was only ever one promotionally released Pokemon card that was a Radiant Pokemon, the Radiant Eevee. I love the Pokemon Go set, and it was the first set that I really made an effort to open with my wife. It introduced her to the TCG, and that's why I will always remember it. The Radiant Eevee never saw any competitive play. The card could be found within the Radiant Eevee Premium Collection, and the card alone sells for around $20 to $25 at the moment. We now have the reverse for Radiant Hawlucha from earlier with the Radiant Gardevoir. Radiant Gardevoir was actually not an awful pick within the competitive side of the TCG. Thanks to its Loving Veil ability, your Pokemon would take 20 less damage from the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon V. The problem was, as I said, this is the time when everyone began to start running V-Star cards in competitive play, and as such, it was arguably less useful. If this card included VMAX and V-Star cards as well within its ability, then I could have seen this being one of the strongest Radiant Pokemon out there. I would argue the best card it was good into was probably Weirdeer V. This card would have some pretty good placements, however you have to wonder how much of these placements were because of the great decks they could be found in. The best placement I could find was within the Mewtwo control deck back in the Toronto Regional, where it was part of a first place deck that contained Mewtwo v Union. The Radiant Gardevoir sells today for $2. There was also an organized play promo of this card that sells for $70, which brings us into another disappointing Radiant Pokemon, the Radiant Sneasler. Again, much like Radiant Blastoise and Radiant Hawlucha, the ability this Pokemon provides is not actually that bad. The ability to triple the amount of damage that your opponent's Pokemon took from poison seemed really strong. However, there really weren't that many cards being used competitively that placed this poison onto your opponent's Pokemon. And even decks that did, like Okidogi and the Loyal Free, would have run Radiant Greninja instead. That is not to say that Radiant Sneasler did not have its moments. Its best placement I could find was in an Eternatus VMAX Galarian Weezing deck at the Charlotte Regionals, where it got first place. Of course, this Pokemon would have both the normal version, which sells for like $1, and the prize pack version, which sells for $15. And to finish out Lost Origin, we have arguably the worst Radiant Pokemon on the list today, Radiant Steelix. Unlike every other Pokemon today, Steelix did not have an ability. Instead, it had a 1 energy supporting move which could attach 2 energy to this Pokemon. There weren't really any decks where the Radiant Steelix could perform, and even with its last-ditch win effort, the circumstances had to be perfect. Destructive Finish would let you discard every card in your deck until only 1 was left. This would then do 60 damage plus 30 for every energy you find there. The average deck runs about 12 to 15 energy cards. So let's say you need 3 for Steelix's move. Take out 4 to 5 for other Pokemon who will be getting those initial knockouts, which leaves you with 7 energy cards in the draw pile, assuming none were prized. This means that Steelix's attack could do 270 damage, which is just barely not enough to knock out a lot of the V-Star or VMAX cards. This is just such a precise requirement and required such perfect conditions to work, and as such, it was just not often worth using. Radiant Steelix would have both a regular version which sells for $1 and a prize pack version which sells for $25, which means it is time to talk about Silver Tempers, starting with the Radiant Serena. Had Radiant Serena been legal for ever so slightly longer, I think more people would have been using it to combat Pokemon from Twilight Masquerade and Shrouded Fable like Frostlass and Munkidori. Serena's elegant heal attack allowed you to heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon once per turn, an excellent way to block Pokemon like Frostlass and Munkidori from cycling damage throughout your team. This card would primarily feature within control decks and Lugia Archeops to slow down the output of your opponent's damage. The best placement Radiant Serena had was at the 2023 EUIC, where it placed first in the Juniors division in London. The regular release version of Radiant Serena sells for $1, whereas the prize pack version sells for $25. Before the days of Munkidori, we had the Radiant Alakazam card. This card has been around for a long time. It was used across a lot of decks, and particularly decks that did not want to bring Munkidori or the dark energy required for it. And as it rotated out of legal play, Munkidori began to rotate in. However, Munkidori has seen a much higher usage than Radiant Alakazam ever did. The Radiant Alakazam had a lot of high finishes, such as in the Arceus, Duraludon, and Umbreon deck, where it placed second in the Juniors division of the 2023 World Championships. The regular version of this card sells for $2, whereas the prize pack version sells for $75. My favorite Radiant card out there is the Radiant Jirachi. I love the Radiant Jirachi card. Jirachi has a great shiny, and this card is just such a funny and disruptive card to bring to any deck. Firstly, its ability and Trusted Wishes would allow you to leave Radiant Jirachi in the active spot. Should your opponent decide to take the shot and knock it out, then you would be able to draw 3 cards. Then you had Astral Misfortune, which had the potential to knock out any Pokemon based on if you could flip 2 heads in a row. The card is such a funny and fast-paced card to have, allowing both setup and disruption. Unfortunately though, that is exactly why it had very little usage. It was a bit too unpredictable, and you would be far better off bringing a different Radiant Pokemon card like Radiant Greninja or Radiant Charizard. The best placement this card ever had was in a Gardevoir Mewtwo deck in the Juniors division of the 2023 World Championships. The regular Radiant Jirachi sells for $1, whereas the prize pack version sells for $35. And then there were 3. The Radiant cards introduced within Crown Zenith. One of these was the Radiant Charizard I talked about earlier, which got a Crown Zenith print, starting with the Radiant Eternatus. Remember towards the tail end of Sword and Shield's lifespan when everyone started to transition away from VMAX cards and start playing with decks like Lugia V-Star, Palkia V-Star, and more? Well, yeah, Radiant Eternatus' Climactic Gate ability would only work with VMAX Pokemon. This card would have enabled VMAX decks to compete against the considerably better V-Star cards. However, no one really wanted to do that. The VMAX cards could not keep up with the V-Star cards, and as such, this Radiant card just never saw any usage. Its best position was 10th of the Natal Regional in Brazil within an Arceus Duraludon deck. Nowadays, the Crown Zenith Radiant Eternatus sells for $1, with the prize pack version going for $30. And finally, the stupidest Radiant Pokemon is Radiant Charjabug. Charjabug is a very weird Pokemon within the competitive scene of Pokemon. For a while, it was a really solid pick in Pokemon Go, being a very high HP and damaging Pokemon, but we're here to talk about the TCG, not Pokemon Go. Radiant Charjabug once again never really saw any usage. I don't know why Pokemon didn't make all of the Radiant Pokemon abilities affect V, VMAX, and V-Star cards, as Charjabug's shocking block ability would only affect your opponent's Pokemon V. This card's regular version sells for like $1 to $2, and then the prize pack version sells for $30.